Hi, I'm Max Keiser, and this is the Keiser Report. We've been talking about the international conflict brewing in various economies around the world engaged in a currency war. Let's go back a couple of months and talk about what we brought to your attention at that time, the war between savers versus speculators. Now Time magazine has picked up on the thread talking about the imminent civil war in America. Stacy Herbert, tell us more.
Max, well, that Time magazine headline reads, "Will the Federal Reserve cause a civil war?" So they're following up basically on a Zero Hedge article in which they predict that the Fed's meeting next week, November 3rd, might lead to civil war due to the quantitative easing that they will introduce. And they said that in a very real sense, Bernanke's throwing Granny and Grandpa down the stairs on purpose. He is literally threatening those at the lower end of the economic strata, along with all who are retired, with starvation and death.
That's right. This is monetary policy that will result in starvation and death. How does this work? In other words, to keep the speculators in business, to keep the money flowing to the banks that have been caught fraudulently selling mortgages, foreclosing on mortgages, and repackaging mortgages, and then making negative bets on these same mortgages using credit default swaps, to keep those guys in business. They want to keep interest rates so low that people who rely on income for food, for sustenance, are literally going to be dead on the street. They're using monetary policy in this way, Ben Bernanke. And he has a lot of blood on his hands. And the way Time magazine is positioning this is as a civil war. And that's exactly what's going on. It's savers versus speculators. It's the same all over the world. And this is the exact same conflict we see in continental Europe, where the folks are on the street rioting. And we see this now in the UK, with the UK's announcement to cut back and impose austerity measures. Once again, bankers are given all the money they need. Everyone else is being forced to live in the street, in the gutter. I mean, this is going to obviously result in massive uprising, riots, and war, of course.
Well, there's another person speaking on this, and that's Chris Whalen, who's an institutional risk analyst. And he was also interviewed on Bloomberg News, talking about this foreclosure gate and the fact that Barack Obama is just like Herbert Hoover and not understanding the situation. And here's what he says on Bloomberg.
I think it's much the same as it was in the 20s and the 30s. The government then didn't realize what was happening. And I think our leaders are caught in the same problem. When you have foreclosures, what's the next thing going to happen? Not a federal moratorium, not a voluntary moratorium by lenders who can't deal with their backlogs anyway. We're going to have state moratoria the way we did in the 30s. Yep. And the governors of those states are going to say, folks, stay in your homes, keep paying your property taxes, default on your mortgage.
Yeah, once again, civil war. In other words, the states are going to instruct people not to pay their mortgages, to pay their property taxes, yeah, but to not pay their mortgages. And the federal government, even if they get involved, the states and the federal government are going to go to war over this issue. He also mentioned that this is what happens during massive deflation. Remember, that's the key concept. There is inflation theoretically if all the money that the Fed is printing causes the money supply to expand and for there to be a reversal in all the damage being done by the bond market imploding as it is or deflating. But so far we haven't seen any evidence of it. The primary threat here is imploding bond market, i.e. deflation.
One thing that is different between now and the Great Depression, when the states did this before, as he mentions, is that the state militias, the National Guard, are all over in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, yeah, the potential for huge civil unrest in the United States, unlike, let's say, when the Soviet-era economy collapsed, the state was still very much involved in providing essentials like transportation and food, etc. In the U.S., none of that exists. So instead of falling out of a one-story building, as Dmitry Orlov has written about brilliantly in his essay, it's like falling out of a 20-story building. And so could be, I'm glad we're a few thousand miles away from that mess.
Well, more on civil war. Here's a headline along this track. New York Fed faces inherent conflict in mortgage buybacks. So the New York Fed, along with PIMCO, is suing Bank of America. And this is trying to force Bank of America to buy back these bad home loans, $47 billion worth. And the reason why the New York Fed owns these mortgages is that they acquired this debt when they rescued Bear Stearns and AIG.
Right, so you see, they play this ping pong game back and forth with each other, and the Fed is supposed to be lender of last resort or have some function in the economy. But what happens is they buy all these bad debts, and they sell them back, and then resecuritize them, and they put some of that off the balance sheet. And then the commercial banks will look at that for a while. They don't want to have to deal with it, so they repackage it and sell it back to the Fed. And this goes on and on and on to the point now where nobody knows who owns what, and there's no way to have any accountability whatsoever. So the only solution is the atomic weapon solution of quantitative easing, and let's keep interest rates near zero, which, as we pointed out, all the savers and all the pensioners and everyone who wants to get a decent wage for the hours that they're working are being penalized. So they're subsidizing. The savers are subsidizing the speculators. The savers, the workers, the pensioners are subsidizing the pathological, incestuous, incestuous psychopaths on Wall Street.
We see this conflict between Wall Street and the entire rest of the U.S. population when Bloomberg says the New York Fed trying to force Bank of America to take back these bad mortgages may be at odds with its mission to ensure the stability of the financial system. So they're basically saying that the entire financial system has been rigged to explode at the least amount of accountability by the bankers. And so therefore the Fed, and no politician for that matter, can ever operate on behalf of the population because it is literally rigged to blow, this financial system, and the Wall Street bankers can manipulate anything.
Now, how is that different than suicide bombers? I mean, these are suicide bankers who say they're rigged to blow. They say, give us more money or we're going to blow up the system. Now, how is Hank Paulson, Jamie Dimon, Lloyd Blankfein, how is that different than some guy in a cafe in Tel Aviv strapped with some C4 who's going to blow himself up for his ideological cause? These guys are blowing themselves up, they're suicide bankers, and they're threatening the global economy and the U.S. economy. Therefore, they qualify as terrorists. And I say this not as a rhetorical device, but as a statement of fact. They're, as Time magazine point out, they put innocent people to death using suicide banking techniques. That's a terrorist. You put the casualties are the innocent civilians that you've gotten caught up through this group punishment by their suicide banking. How come they're not in Guantanamo Bay? How come, Lloyd Blankfein is not in a small Guantanamo Bay-like cell right now, having his orifices probed by curious U.S. servicemen?
You know, the midterm elections are coming up and everybody's pretending that these Tea Party people are all going to be about rescuing us from these evil bankers, because that's exactly how it started. It was a reaction against Hank Paulson and George Bush rescuing the financial system. Here is a headline by a co-founder of the Tea Party, Carl Denninger, who we have had on the show before. To the Tea Party, go screw yourself.
Eloquent Carl, as always.
Well, this is on his blog, and at first he threatens to sue the Tea Party for using the phrase Tea Party for defamation. And then he says, yeah, that's a joke, but so are you, all of you, especially Sarah Palin, Newt Gingrich, Bob Barr, and douchebag groups such as Tea Party Patriots. And he points out that he's gone to several meetings as a leader of the Tea Party, and it always descends into guns, gays, and God. And they talk nothing about the banking oligarchy and these fraud after fraud in the last 2 or 3 weeks leading up to this election season, and they have said zero about it. So he implies that the Tea Party is now, quote, nothing other than the Republican Party, stealing the anger of a population that was fed up with the Republican Party's own theft of their tax money at gunpoint to bail out the robbers of Wall Street and fraudulently redirecting it back toward electing the very people who stole all the bleeping money.
Well, it's propaganda. Remember, Hitler came out with a propaganda film, Triumph of the Will, which glorified the triumphs of Nazism. And this is what basically Sarah Palin has been co-opted by the Republican Party and the Koch brothers, multi-billion-dollar schmatas down there in frickin' Nowheresville, America, who tap into the fact that Sarah Palin's got cute ankles, and they spin that somehow into a propaganda film to convince millions of people that they should forget the whole Constitution thingy and focus more on how to make the Koch brothers more money. It's become a cult of personalities. I mean, Sarah Palin is a personality cult. She represents the same thing that Hitler represented, which is that if you forget your fellow citizen here, you forget your neighbor for a moment and think only about yourself and the glorious possibilities of being a venal, vainglorious, self-centered moron, you too can get $10 or $20 million from William Morris or whoever her talent agent is by stumping in front of millions a propaganda issue that at the end of the day only make the same freaking corporations richer. That's all it does.
Well, on a headline on that, the final headline, Max, conservative ultra-rich plot their takeover. And this is from Huffington Post talking about the Koch brothers. Apparently, it emerged that in February they plotted the takeover of this, the winning of these midterm elections. And at the meetings were Glenn Beck, Karl Rove, Justices Scalia and Thomas. But these are the ones financing the demagogues, the likes of Sarah Palin, the likes of Christine O'Donnell, who just this week had no idea even what the First Amendment was, though she claims to be a constitutional expert.
Well, it was later revealed that she spent 7 days in a Hilton hotel somewhere studying the Constitution as it was printed up on a placemat at the local diner. I think that was her sole educational course in terms of constitutional expertise. Look, I mean, the Koch brothers, going back to World War II, 6 million got incinerated. The Koch brothers' objective is to incinerate 6 billion with their basically global warming, man-made global warming is the basis of their empire. They won't be happy until everyone's basically charcoal. So Sarah Palin knows this, and she just wants to make a few bucks on the way to the bonfire of what was called humanity. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Well, when we come back, we're talking with James Howard Kunstler. He's got a new novel out. Very interesting stuff. Don't go away. Time now to go to New York to talk with author, blogger, and expert on urban development, James Howard Kunstler, author of the new book, The Witch of Hebron. James, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Nice to be here, Max.
All right, I want to ask you about a front page headline recently featured on Huffington Post called Twilight of the Suburbs. The article highlights the exploding poverty rates in the suburbs post-financial collapse. Now, you predicted this as far back as 1994 in your book, The Geography of Nowhere. How and why did this suburban disaster happen? How much worse will it get? James Howard Kunstler.
Well, it was sort of self-evident that the suburban living arrangement was a way of life with no future. And I've been referring to it for a long time as the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of the world. And you can call it that because, it's quite simple. We have a problem with our energy supply. We have a problem with oil. And American suburbia was designed to run on oil, and it's not going to run on anything else. And so, we're going to see a very complex kind of disintegration of it that will express itself in a lot of ways. And, the first way that it's expressing itself is the tremendous distress in property values and in the financial health of households.
Now, your basic premise here goes along the lines of what many call peak oil, and they write many detailed white papers on the subject. And the late, great Matt Simmons, of course, wrote about the twilight in the desert, about peak oil. But the book, The Witch of Hebron, is a novel, so it's a story about what's happened. Why did you choose to write this as a novel, not as fiction, as opposed to nonfiction?
Well, I wrote a nonfiction book. I published it in 2005 from the Atlantic Monthly Press. It was called The Long Emergency, and it was explicitly about the global oil predicament and how it would converge with things like the global warming problem and the financial fiasco to create an era of hardship and vicissitude that would go on for a long time. And after I wrote that book, I wanted to depict what that life would feel like, what the texture of that life would be in a post-industrial collapse America, a post-oil America. So I wrote a book called World Made by Hand. It was a novel, and The Witch of Hebron is the sequel.
All right, now, reading the book, you've got really, within this catastrophe, there's a ray of a hope, actually, for a future which gets back more to an era in American history of self-reliance as, let's say, personified by the folks of Emerson or Thoreau, and getting back to that kind of America on Walden Pond, and of course, Walt Whitman's classic, I Hear America Puking, updated for the 21st century. But what's your comment on this?
Well, that was a very explicit agenda of mine. I wanted to get, I wanted to get across to the public that leaving behind many of the modern conveniences and blandishments of our age is not necessarily going to be a terrible thing. There may be a lot of benefits for us. We may not have iPods anymore. And in the book, the electricity has pretty much gone out, and so has the internet. And we may not have those things, but we're going to be working shoulder to shoulder with our neighbors, and we're going to be working at things that matter, not sitting in a cubicle. We're going to be making our own music with people we know, not just buying canned entertainment. And we're going to feel the textures of life and nature again. So, the book that I wrote was not The Road. I was trying to write an antidote to the road, to allow people to really feel the sensual beauty of a world that is no longer dominated by machines and the noise of engines and the tyranny of the automobile.
Right, so The Road, of course, is this movie that's come out recently, a bit of a dystopian nightmare like the Mad Max movies about a world gone psychotic with the end of cheap energy. But you've got a vision which is more, as we were just saying here, in keeping with a part of an American history which goes back to this era of self-reliance. And which is interesting because this American character that people refer to as the most, entrepreneurial, ingenious in the world, of course, it doesn't exist anymore so much because of the availability of all this cheap oil that has kind of snuffed out or made Americans' life way too easy. The economy runs on cheap oil, and talk a little bit about, for example, the suburbs and the exurbs, and with the how once you turn the taps off on this cheap oil, just talk a little bit about the chain of events, the chain reaction that occurs in the suburbs, how the lights go out and what happens.
Well, I actually saw the preview of coming attractions. I was a young newspaper reporter in 1973, and I covered the OPEC oil embargo in a pretty suburban area around the Capital District of New York. And, you could see the almost instant failure of the suburban living arrangement. But, there's also kind of there are a series of mental failures that the American population is going through right now. There are some very dangerous beliefs that have become normal. For example, the idea that when you wish upon a star, your dreams come true. This used to be a normal idea for 7-year-olds in America. Now it's a normal idea for everybody. And the companion idea is the idea that it's possible to get something for nothing, which is what all the legalized gambling in America is based on, but also Wall Street. And particularly the fraudulent operations of the past 20 years. And when you combine those two ideas, that when you wish upon a star, you'll get something for nothing, you get the current temperament of the American public. And it's a very bad mental space to be in, I think.
Right, so last year, I believe 25 top hedge fund managers got $1 billion in compensation each. And you can argue that they don't really do anything except shuffle paper around and game the system. And then the rest of America, as you point out, has become infantilization has set in. So you've got folks regressing to this state of literally looking for the next teat to get their free meal from. They don't seem to have, they've forgotten this whole era of self-reliance and this whole era of can-do. But it exists as a myth, but it doesn't really exist in reality, does it?
No, but you know, we're doing an awful lot right now in American politics to prevent ourselves from getting beyond this and thriving and finding new ways to reorganize our society. The financial fiasco is largely about the disappearance of capital. You know, and this was the capital that we hoped would be there to rebuild our economy, to build a post-oil economy.
Right, so when Obama talks about, hey, we're going to increase runways and freeways, he fails to mention that we're running out of oil. Now, to get back to the point that you were making about America seems to be completely missing the boat here, a recent Rasmussen poll out last weekend shows that 58% of U.S. voters think that finding new sources of energy is more important than reducing the amount of energy Americans now consume. And a majority continue to support the deep water drilling despite the BP oil spill. So more of the same thing, I guess you could say.
Well, there's another current of thinking or delusion that's abroad in the land, is what I call techno-grandiosity or techno-triumphalism. You know, the idea that we're going to tech our way through this, or that there's some set of magical rescue remedies that's going to allow us to, you know, muddle through the energy predicament. And the truth of the matter is, Max, that no combination of wind, solar, ethanol, biodiesel, biomass, dark matter, used French fried potato oil is going to allow us to run Walmart, Walt Disney World, the interstate highway system, the U.S. Army, and suburbia, or even a fraction of it. And the key to understanding where we're at is, and I don't want to be misunderstood because I'm not inveighing against alternative energy. I'm quite sure we're going to use everything we possibly can. But we're going to be disappointed in what these things can do for us. You know, we're going to be disappointed in what they can do. We desperately need to make other arrangements for everyday life in America. The way we produce our food, the way we inhabit the landscape, the way we do commerce, etc.
All right, now just to fill in a bit of the economic putty holding this delusion together, the peak oil and the peak credit are coterminous. Just as we've run out of credit supplied through the continuation of oil into the economy, as oil peaks out, it'll also decapitalize the ability to raise fresh credit. So you've got these two things collapsing at the same time. Now let's move on to your thoughts on the U.S. real estate racket. What does the wholesale fraud coming to light tell you about America, its financial system, and what was once called the rule of law?
Yeah, the rule of law is very much on everybody's lips these days. In 10 days it's managed to become a cliche, although we didn't appear to think about it for the last 20 years. And the trouble with the absence of the rule of law in money matters is that when it's not there, people lose their faith in the operations of money and banking. And when people lose their faith in the operations of money and banking, money begins to lose its value and its legitimacy. And it's a very dangerous game. As Joni Mitchell once said, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And we're going to suffer if we cannot reestablish that in money matters.
Finally, James Howard Kunstler, the Republicans are expected to retake the House with those Tea Party Republicans due to gain several seats. Now, are the Tea Party Republicans set to restore the self-reliant American roots you imagine in your book, Witch of Hebron?
I think that both of the Republicans and the Democrats run the risk of undergoing what the Whigs did in the late 1850s. You know, that's the last time that the nation was in a comparable convulsion. And the Whig Party disappeared so quickly, you know, and so thoroughly that people were looking under their teapots for him, like, where are the Whigs? What happened to them? And I think that both the Republicans and Democrats are in danger of doing this, although I am personally not a tea bagger or a Tea Party subscriber. You know, it seems to me that their ideology is pretty incoherent, you know, kind of a combination of the old John Birch Society propaganda and, you know, UFO lore. So they're really just part of the general delusional thinking picture that's now rampant in the USA.
what happens is somebody like Ron Paul would come up with a reasonable platform for political reform, and then some shiksa gets involved like Sarah Palin, and Willie Morris picks up her account, and it's all back to celebrity culture. That's the arc of political progress in America today.
Well, maybe instead of a campaign, we should just, have our politics all on Dancing with the Stars, and it can be all about, how well you dance.
Yeah, well, as long as the lights...
That seems to be where we're at the moment.
Right, as long as the lights are on, which requires cheap oil, and that period is coming to a rapid close. All right, James Howard Kunstler, the book is The Witch of Hebron, and it's a fantastic book. It gives you kind of a real-life fictional version of the apocalypse soon to be upon us. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you for reading my book, Max, and thanks to Stacy, too.
Well, Stacy actually read the book, and then she told me about it.
Okay, well, there's going to be a quiz.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and the book reading, Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, James Howard Kunstler. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.